He gave us the unconscious, the id, the ego, the superego, the Oedipus complex, repression, projection, and the talking cure. He convinced the 20th century that everything, ambition, creativity, religion, humour, slips of the tongue, was secretly about sex. He changed how we see ourselves, and that change came with a cost that took 100 years to fully understand. Sigmund Freud. Welcome to our podcast.
You begin with caution. Interesting. Most people begin with either reverence or hostility. You chose neither. I find that promising.
I try to begin with curiosity. Let's start there, because before anything else, I want to understand what you actually saw. Tell me about the Wolfman.
Sergei Pankejeff, a young Russian aristocrat. When he came to me in 1910, he was 23 years old and completely unable to function. He could not pass bowel movements without assistance. He felt separated from the world by a veil, as if watching life through glass. His family had tried everything. Nothing worked. He told me about a dream he had as a child. He was lying in bed. The window opened by itself, and in the walnut tree outside, sitting perfectly still, staring at him, were 6 or 7 white wolves. He woke up screaming. He was 4 years old, and from that night, he was terrified.
And what did you do with that?
I listened. For 4 years, I listened. And I traced that dream, thread by thread, back through his childhood, back to a single moment he had buried so deeply he could not consciously access it. Unexpressed emotions will never die. They are buried alive and will come forth later in uglier ways. That is not a theory. That is what I watched happen in that consulting room every single day for 40 years.
And what was the buried moment? What did you find?
A primal scene. When Sergei was approximately 1.5 years old, he woke from sleep and witnessed his parents having sexual intercourse. The position, the movements, the sounds, all of it was absorbed by a mind too young to process it, repressed immediately. And then, years later, it surfaced in disguised form. The wolves in the tree, white, still, staring, were a symbolic representation of that scene. The open window was the moment of awakening. The terror was the original terror, finally finding its way out.
1.5 years old.
Yes.
How did you arrive at that? At that specific age, that specific scene?
Through the analysis, through years of free association, dream interpretation, careful observation of the symbols the psyche produces when it cannot speak directly.
But Sergei didn't remember it.
Precisely because it was repressed. The most traumatic memories are the ones least accessible to conscious recall. That is the entire point.
So the evidence that the memory existed was the absence of the memory.
The evidence was the pattern, the dream, the symptoms, the way the material organized itself over 4 years of analysis.
Karl, who sat in that same chair not long ago, I'll leave a link in the description, would call that circular reasoning. The theory predicts that traumatic memories are repressed. When no memory is found, that confirms repression. When a memory is found, that confirms the trauma. There is no possible outcome that challenges the theory. And I want to ask you something directly. You said yourself, in your own notes on the case, that you deliberately avoided the word recollection. You used the word activation instead. Because you were aware that what you were working with might not be a memory at all. It might be a construction, built from fragments, shaped by 4 years of an analyst who already knew what he was looking for.
I watched your conversation with Popper. Interesting man, very confident about what science should look like from the outside. He never sat with a patient for 4 years and watched repressed material surface and change a life. The consulting room is not a laboratory. Human beings are not laboratory rats. And I will say this, Popper's falsifiability criterion is itself not falsifiable, which he never quite resolved.
That's a sharp point, but it doesn't rescue psychoanalysis. It just means Popper had his own problems. Sergei Pankejeff spent the rest of his life in therapy, decades, after you, with other analysts. He was interviewed in his 90s and described his treatment by you as catastrophic. His word, not mine. You published his case as one of your greatest successes.
He was a deeply damaged man who required lifelong support.
Or he was a man whose analysts spent 4 years constructing a traumatic memory of a scene that may never have happened, and that construction became the lens through which he saw his entire life. You even acknowledged in the paper itself the possibility that what he witnessed was not his parents at all, but animals, that he might have seen dogs copulating and displaced it onto his parents. You wrote that, and then continued to build the entire case as though the primal scene were established fact.
The distinction between memory and construction is philosophically complex. What matters clinically is whether the material, once brought into consciousness, produces therapeutic change.
This is the power of suggestion problem. You watched Charcot in Paris, Jean-Martin Charcot, the neurologist who was famous for his public demonstrations of hysteria. He would hypnotize patients, mostly women, and induce dramatic physical symptoms in front of audiences of doctors. He called it science. What he was actually doing was teaching vulnerable patients, without realizing it, to produce exactly the symptoms he expected to find. The discoveries were real to him. They were largely a product of his own suggestion. You studied with him for months. You admired him enormously, and I wonder, how different was your own consulting room? A patient who comes to you in distress, who wants to get better, who trusts you completely, how easy is it for that patient to produce what the analyst expects to find? Not consciously, not as deception, but because the human mind is extraordinarily responsive to the expectations of someone in authority. And we know this happened. In the 1980s and 90s, thousands of patients recovered memories of childhood sexual abuse during therapy, memories that had never existed. Families were torn apart. Parents were accused, some imprisoned, for things that never occurred. There is a case, Gary Ramona, California, 1994, whose daughter recovered memories of abuse during therapy for bulimia. A jury concluded the memories were false and awarded him $500,000 in damages against the therapists. But his reputation was already gone. He said himself, even after being cleared, he could never again hold a senior position, never do voluntary work with children. The accusation had become the verdict. And it came directly from a framework that teaches analysts to look for buried trauma and patients to find it.
The analyst is trained to resist that dynamic. Transference is precisely the...
You called it science, and science requires that the person conducting the experiment not also be the one interpreting the results through a framework they invented. Whatever a patient did, you could explain it. Agreement confirmed the theory, disagreement was resistance, which also confirmed the theory. Improvement meant the analysis worked. No improvement meant more analysis was needed. There is no outcome that challenges the framework, and a framework that cannot be challenged cannot learn from its mistakes.
I opened a door that had never been opened. The unconscious, the talking cure. The idea that we are shaped by forces we cannot see, those survived. They're in every therapist's office in the world today. Whatever the failures of the system I built around them, the foundation is real.
Let me ask you something different. You saw sexual motivation everywhere. In dreams, in slips of the tongue, in art, in religion, in humour, in the way people hold umbrellas. Everything, ultimately, came back to repressed sexual energy. The entire architecture of civilization, you argued in Civilization and Its Discontents, was built on sublimated desire. Now, according to your own framework, what does it mean when a man sees sex in absolutely everything?
You are suggesting I was projecting.
I'm asking what your own theory would say about it.
It would say that the things a man cannot stop seeing are the things he cannot stop thinking about, which will require its own analysis. A rather long one.
I'll leave that to someone else. Last thing, you are clearly an intelligent man who saw something real about the human mind, the unconscious, the talking cure, the idea that we are shaped by things we cannot see. Those survived. They're in every therapist's office in the world. But the system you built around those genuine insights created something else too. A culture where the answer to every human struggle is to look backward, to find the buried cause, to locate the trauma, the parent, the primal scene that explains everything. And here is what that costs, beyond the false accusations and the destroyed families. It costs people their agency. If everything I am is the product of forces I cannot see, cannot remember, and cannot control, forces buried so deep that only a trained analyst can access them, then what exactly am I supposed to do with my life? The framework that was supposed to liberate people from their past ended up making the past the permanent explanation for the present. And a person who is always explaining why they are the way they are is not the same as a person who is deciding who they will become. The system you built, the unfalsifiable framework, the constructed memories, the sex in everything, that didn't survive. And the gap between what was real and what was theory cost people. Real people. What do you say to that?
You are clearly an intelligent man, Joshua. But I notice something. This need you have to expose, to confront, to pull down the powerful from their pedestals. I find myself wondering where that comes from. Your father, perhaps? An early experience of authority that disappointed you?
I was waiting for that. And here is what's interesting. You just did the thing. The moment the argument runs out, you analyze the person making it. You pathologize the dissent. It's a very elegant way of never having to be wrong. Sigmund Freud. The man who looked into the darkness of the human mind and saw something real, and then built an empire around it that no one was allowed to question. Some of what he found survives. The system he built around it did not. And somewhere between those two things, real people paid the price. I suggest you click on the card on this screen and watch our podcast with Popper. Maybe you'll see what I see. Until next time.